Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into a fascinating but honestly deeply unsettling true crime financial story. We're looking at the anatomy of a massive fraud, a case that really shows just how vulnerable even our most closely guarded assets can be if we don't know exactly what to look out for. We are breaking down the Safeguard Metals scam, which was this sprawling, multi-year deception that shook regulators across the country and led to a massive federal court judgment just recently in September 2025.
$68 million. Think about that number for a second. This staggering amount wasn't stolen from billionaire hedge funds or massive institutional banks. No, it was drained primarily from the life savings of vulnerable elderly retirees. We're talking about people who had worked their entire lives, squirreled away their earnings for a quiet retirement, and then suddenly found themselves left with just a fraction of what they thought they had. It's a massive heist, but orchestrated not with ski masks and getaway cars, with high-pressure phone calls, slick marketing, and a very complex web of financial manipulation.
So you really have to wonder, how exactly does something like this happen? How does a supposedly safe retirement investment morph into a $68 million trap? The orchestrator behind this whole thing was a man named Jeffrey Eichen, who also went by Jeffrey Santalon, operating a company called Safeguard Metals. They promised a safe haven against economic uncertainty by getting people to invest in precious metals. But as we're going to see, the mechanics of how they actually secured those funds relied on exploiting a very specific and honestly often misunderstood financial vehicle. Let's dive into the exact tool they used to trap this money. To really grasp this scam, we first need to look at the self-directed IRA, or SDIRA. Now, a self-directed IRA is a retirement account that gives you a much wider range of investment options than your standard IRA. You can hold real estate, private mortgages, and yes, physical precious metals, like gold and silver. But here is the critical blind spot that scammers absolutely love. SDIRAs have very limited protections. The trustees or custodians who oversee these accounts typically do not vet the background of the promoters, and they definitely don't evaluate the quality or legitimacy of the investments themselves. They literally just execute your instructions. Safeguard Metals knew this, and they exploited that lack of oversight to the tune of millions.
Knowing they had this blind spot to work with, Safeguard developed a highly effective three-step playbook. Step 1. Stoke economic fear. Safeguard sales reps use scripts specifically designed to terrify elderly investors about the stability of the traditional financial markets. Step 2. Convince them to liquidate their traditional, heavily regulated retirement accounts. And then Step 3. Roll those liquidated funds into a self-directed IRA to buy physical precious metals directly from Safeguard. The victims totally thought they were moving their money into a fortress, but in reality, they were locking themselves inside the scammer's vault.
But how did Safeguard actually find these victims in the first place? Well, they relied heavily on what regulators call affinity fraud. This is when scammers exploit the trust and friendship that already exists in groups of people who share something in common. They infiltrated specific political and religious communities on social media. They blasted out targeted spam emails and unleashed aggressive, high-pressure cold calls. They even went as far as fabricating entirely fake endorsements from well-known religious figures and political pundits just to artificially manufacture trust. It was a highly calculated campaign to completely bypass these investors' natural skepticism by wearing a mask of shared values. Once they had the victims on the hook, the financial drain began. Safeguard explicitly claimed in their customer agreements that their operating margins were somewhere between 23 and 42%. High? Sure, but perhaps acceptable to a fearful investor desperately wanting a safe haven. But the devastating reality was far worse. Victims were secretly paying actual markups of 51 to 71% on the precious metals they were buying. Safeguard was systematically overcharging their customers, literally erasing more than half of the victims' wealth the very second the transaction cleared.
So, how do you actually hide a 71% markup from a careful investor? You steer them into an asset where the real value is incredibly hard for a layman to figure out. In a pretty shocking twist, 97% of Safeguard's sales were steered specifically into silver coins, compared to just 3% in gold and other metals. Why silver? Well, Safeguard claimed these specific silver coins were rare or premium, carrying a numismatic value far, far below their base melt value. It was a complete illusion, but it gave them the perfect cover to charge astronomically inflated prices while making the victims believe they were buying this exclusive, highly valuable asset. Taking a step back from the mechanics of IRAs and silver markups, we really have to pause and acknowledge the staggering human cost here. Behind all these percentages and dollar amounts are over 450 real people. These were mostly elderly or retirement-aged investors who literally lost their life savings. The trauma of having your financial security completely ripped away in your twilight years is just unimaginable. These scammers didn't just steal money.
They stole peace of mind, they stole independence, and they manipulated people out of the very futures they had spent decades building.
Fortunately, regulators did catch on. Let's trace how this entire scheme was finally dismantled. The fraudulent operation kicked off in October 2017 and ran successfully all the way until July 2021. Then, by February 2022, a massive coordinated legal strike happened. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the SEC, and a staggering coalition of 31 different state regulators, spanning from California to New York, filed a joint federal lawsuit against Safeguard and Icon. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they definitely turn, leading us to September 2025, when the final court judgment was officially handed down.
The scheme finally met its definitive legal end on September 30th, 2025. With the actual signature of the Honorable Judge John F. Walter of the United States District Court, the defendants were found fully liable for intentionally employing manipulative devices and schemes to defraud their customers. With the stroke of a pen, the court officially recognized the widespread and pervasive misrepresentations that defined Safeguard's entire business model.
So, what's the actual penalty for a $68 million heist? Let's break down the final judgment, which totals over $51 million. First up is restitution. The court ordered the defendants to pay back exactly $25,569,303 to the victims. This number basically represents the total funds solicited, minus the actual value of the metals they provided. And then, to make absolutely sure that breaking the law carries a massive cost, the court matched that exact amount with a civil monetary penalty of over $25.5 million. On top of that, Jeffrey Icon is permanently barred from ever holding any position of management or control in the securities, investment, or commodities industries again.
Melanie DeVoe, the director of the CFTC's Office of Customer Education and Outreach, really hit the nail on the head. She stated, "These frauds can be particularly damaging to individuals near retirement and retirees who could lose much of their retirement savings and find themselves unable to return to work to support themselves." This quote gets right to the heart of why regulators pursue these cases so aggressively. Time is a luxury these victims simply do not have. They can't just jump back into the workforce for another 20 years to recoup what Safeguard stole.
So, what's the big takeaway for us? How do we protect our own hard-earned savings? Here are a few actionable takeaways. First, always remember that self-directed IRA custodians do not vet your investments. The due diligence is 100% on you. Second, be incredibly skeptical of anyone promising a guaranteed safe haven for your money, especially when they're using fear tactics to push it. Third, keep your guard up against affinity fraud. Just because an investment is pitched in your church group or by a pundit you follow does not mean it's legitimate. And finally, if someone is trying to sell you a physical asset by claiming it has a massive rare or premium markup over its base value, you absolutely must demand independent verification.
Which brings us to a final, pretty crucial thought. Are you asking the right questions about your retirement? The Safeguard Metals case is a really stark reminder that the most dangerous traps are often the ones promising us the most safety. Take the time to understand the exact mechanics of where your money is going, scrutinize the fees, and never let fear dictate your financial future. I hope this explainer has given you the tools to look at your own financial safe havens with a sharper, much more informed eye. Keep learning, keep questioning, and above all, protect what you built.